building Tyranids for the first time? No instructions. Let's do it. Hello, hobby friends. Like a lot of people out there, I bought the Leviathan box at the start of 10th edition, and over half a year later, I still haven't painted a single model from the whole box. Hopefully I'm not the only one. Anyway, let's remedy that by building some Tyranids. Now, the way I like to build models is to cut out all the parts at once. This approach is one I've developed for saving time while building Gundam models, and I carried it over when I got into Warhammer. As you may have seen in my previous videos, I'm really used to working with second-hand Space Marines, which do not come with instructions. Shocking, I know. However, I've never built Tyranids before, so this ought to be fun. And you know what? It actually was fun. I had a lot less trouble than I thought figuring out where each limb went to each of these Von Ryan's leapers. Von Ryan would be pleased if he saw these. Filled with quickly accrued confidence, I tried my hobby hands at two of the box's big beasties. It was going fine until I got to the arms of the Neurotyrant. I was having some trouble getting its arms in place due to assembling the carapace prematurely, and also I wasn't sure which of the two armholes they went into. Time to look at the product image. I think the larger of the two pairs of arms go on top. I think. Maybe I'm not saving time by doing this. I did get them together though, and other than the small hiccup with the arms, they were actually pretty pleasant to put together. On to some of the smaller ones. This is what 20 loose Termagaunt bodies looks like. Only a sane and rational person would do something like this. To build the bodies, I separated them into a pile of legs and bodies, and then got to work playing matchmaker. Some of the matches were close, but no cigar, though I did make progress little by little. On many of them, I trimmed the peg at the hip to make test fitting a bit easier. I actually do this on all of my push fit minis, that way I can easily disassemble them after dry fitting. And the excess plastic cement on the peg has somewhere to flow into during the final push of assembly. Okay, let's take a break from puzzling out those parts to repose this one specific Termagaunt. Looking at this guy's pose, it sort of looks like they're standing on their hind legs, screeching as the horde runs past. So let's get him in more of a standing pose. First, I'm going to drill out the shoulder for one of the subarms. Then I use the teeth of my needle nose pliers to press striations into some armature wire. These marks will give the wire more of a grit for superglue to grab onto. I get the glue on the end and insert it into the shoulder hole. While that dries, I drill out the cavity in the body that corresponds to the subarm and plug it with an appropriately sized peg. Clipping off the end is a bit tricky due to the overhanging carapace. I remove the last bit of the peg with my hobby knife, using the thumb pushing technique so I don't accidentally slash my finger by accident. I drill a hole in the peg of the same diameter as the wire. Gee, I wonder what's going to attach there. I clip the subarm off the spool, leaving a short length of wire sticking out from the shoulder. With the new shoulder joint mostly done, I separate the subarm from the right leg. I use an expensive pair of nippers to make a quick clean cut. Then I clean up the leg as well as the elbow. With that, I can finally attach the subarm. Now I know what you might be thinking. That's a lot of work to end up with what you started with. And to that I say, you fool! I'm nowhere near finished. This is just the beginning. The reason I installed the armature wire is so I can move the subarm outward. Also, I do not trust plastic cement with this kind of modification. Using my pliers, I bend the wire to the desired angle and plug it in for a test fit. Oh, cool! I love it when my hard work is ruined. Instead of bending the wire and gluing it in like I should have done in the first place, I carve and drill plastic away from the top of the artificial armpit. Now I can glue the straight wire in at an angle. To reinforce it, I put a dollop of superglue under the wire and dump some baking soda on it to quickly set it. Let's test fit it again. There we go. That's what I'm looking for. In fact, the whole procedure was so fun that I'm gonna do it again on the other arm. And to make it even more fun, this arm is molded directly to the body. Of course, why would it ever be easy? To repose it, I first need to remove a chunk of plastic tying it to the body. For this, I break out the drill again. A lesser known use for hand drills and pin vices is to remove chunks of plastic from the middle of a mini. By carefully carving away the thin walls left over from the drilling, a sizable vacancy opens up in place of the plastic roadblock that was just there minutes ago. Now, this next part is potentially quite dangerous. Only attempt if you have a lot of hobby knife experience. I've gone to the hospital before after a hobby knife incident, so I'm well aware of how dangerous they are. The danger here is that I'm pressing the knife with the same hand that's holding it, resulting in a lack of control. If the knife were to slip out somehow, I'd be in real trouble. Luckily, nothing bad happened. At least not to me. As I was twisting the blade to try and force the arm off, I accidentally broke it above the elbow. Despite that, I'm continuing to attack the shoulder, very carefully mind you. At last, I am able to free the arm from its plastic shackles. While assessing the damage, I noticed that the break in the bicep has an angled zigzag to it, rather than a clean break. Due to the angle and the increased surface area, all I have to do for a solid bond is to slap on some cement and wait for it to solidify. While I wait, let's tackle the leg and the tail. Like the first subarm, I use my nice nippers to separate them, though I did forget to record that part. Then I simply pry the parts apart. With the tail out of the way, all I have to do is carve a little bit of plastic off the top of the hip, and I can hijack the pre-existing peg by rotating the leg to its new position. Before I do that though, I need to angle the currently attached leg outwards by a little bit. To accomplish this, I carve a groove in the attachment chunk and widen it 1 mm at a time with each pass of the knife. Eventually, I have a deep, narrow canyon between the thigh and the front of the pelvis. At this point, I started deepening the canyon further on the table because it was feeling a bit too dangerous. Once it's deep enough, I use an obscure modeling technique known as brute force. Never underestimate the raw power of brute force. Now that's one wide canyon. Because it's in a hard-to-see place, I'm not going to try super hard on gap filling it. I start by cutting a disc off of a soft plastic peg from a Gundam runner. This might not be the safest way to do this, but I stick it on the end of my knife, which will serve as an applicator. After double checking that it's the correct width, I get some cement on it, only for it to slide off the knife. Crap. So I got it back on the knife, then I wedge this wedge into position. I did end up accidentally pushing it out, because of course I would. With it finally in place, I lather on some thick plastic cement. Now that the left leg is properly repositioned, I plug the right leg in place and check the overall pose to see if I like it as is, or if I want to make further adjustments. Once I'm satisfied, the right leg gets its own share of gloopy goo. I make sure to hit it from multiple angles for a solid bond. Coming back to the left arm, I start shaping another Gundam plastic runner piece, this time into a weird, square taper with a divot in one side. I test fit it, then cement it in place. In addition to this, the bicep joint isn't fully dry yet, so I set it aside to work on another part. This time, the butt protrusion, or tail as some people call it. To strengthen the joint, I drill a hole in a normal place to drill a hole, and do the same for the tail. I texture more armature wire and glue it into the tail hole. When doing this, I like to keep the wire attached to the spool, that way it makes it easier to manipulate. Plus, I don't have to do as much guesswork on the length, since I can clearly see how much is sticking out when I cut it. It's nothing special, just a little trick I use when pinning. I test fit the tail and make a number of adjustments, such as bending the armature wire and widening the mouth of the hole. Once it looks properly aligned, I deepen the hole. I could cut the wire shorter, but this way should result in a bit more durability. Then I get some sticky liquid on the rod and quickly insert it into the butthole, as deep as it goes. I finish it off by tracing the joint with cement to further lock it in place. Upon re-examining the right hip joint, I found a noticeable gap, so I filled it just like the left side with a plastic wedge and lots of cement. Back to the tail. Due to the more upright stance this guy has, I need to bend the tail upwards. I can't think of any other way to bend it, so I'm just going to brute force it again. It does develop a crack, but that's nothing more gap-filling cement can't fix. It's no joke when your plastic crack has a crack in the plastic. It's not much, but if you compare it to the original, it's curved slightly more upwards. With everything else done, all I have to do now is attach the left arm. Oh wait, it's not symmetrical. Crap, I'm gonna have to fully repose this, aren't I? Well, I cut the arm at the joints and plastic cement it back together. While that dries, since it's the last reposing part, I get to work on figuring out which gun-holding arms go on this gaunt. Many arm combinations came really close to fitting, but not quite. Eventually, I found a pair that fit if I bent them by the slightest degree. I trimmed the pegs to allow for cement. If you try this out for yourself, it would be best to cut away from yourself. At the very least, just like me, the blade I'm using is not too sharp. Before I can cement them though, I need to cut off the shoulder blade so the arm can properly fit. Something I wouldn't have to do if I hadn't mixed up the arms of 20 miniatures. After I cement the arm in position, I test fit the shoulder blade, and cement that one too. It's hard to tell that it was ever detached in the first place. For the right subarm, I switch to superglue, and then switch back to cement for the left arm since it has a plastic peg. I think I used a plastic peg for this one since I needed something thicker than the 1.5mm wire. Here is the normal unedited sculpt, and here is the reposed sculpt. Oh my gosh, I am so pleased with how fierce and aggressive this Termagaunt has turned out. It really looks like it's screaming its head off. Awesome! Now, it's time to go back to the other gaunts. Shouldn't take too long. I mean, there's only more than a dozen left, and it's not like all their parts are mixed up or anything. I try matching the arms into pairs, but it's just as slow as testing the arms on the bodies. Some arms don't even fit on certain bodies, which helps to eliminate some of the possibilities. Another one assembled, but this is still way too slow. I have less than half of the gaunts completed at this point. But then I got an idea. Since there are 2 of each sculpt, I paired up the bodies as well as the arms as best I could. This drastically sped up the process, and I had most of them assembled in no time. Though I did have to repose another shoulder blade. Eventually, I had only 2 left. The problem was that neither of the remaining arms fit onto one of the torsos. Can't imagine why. So it looks like I'm repositioning my 3rd shoulder blade. At this time, I would like to mention that I ended up buying the Tyranid half of my friend's Leviathan box. I mean, I want a horde of Tyranids, and it was way too good of a deal to pass up. As I assembled them, I noticed something interesting about the monopose termagaunts. Apparently, the parts are organized into groups depending on which gaunt pose they go to. This means that there was an easy, straightforward method to build the gaunts without instructions the whole time. It's something you'd only notice if you didn't cut out all the parts at once. But hey, I learned something from it, so it's all good. Probably. It's time for the bases. Also, this one leaper just randomly landed perfectly upright, peering over the side of the box. After some goofing around with the push-fit system, here are the nids on their bases. As someone who almost never has more than 1 unit at a time on their bases, this is quite the sight for me. But these bases are looking a little too plain. Let's spice them up. These are wads of polymer clay that I pressed down onto a sheet of aluminum foil and baked. They should make for some nice elevation. How'd a Terminator head get in here? Speaking of termies, let's get these termagaunts ready. A lot of the new monopose nids have all kinds of junk molded next to their feet. The fact that the only bits of rubble on an otherwise completely flat base are always next to the feet really bugs me. Pun intended. So I go through the various steps of removing the unwanted plastic. Because these little bits of terrain serve as a bridge between the base and the mini, I need to pin the model if I want to successfully attach it to its base. This wouldn't be so bad if there weren't 40 of them. Seriously, look at this pile. As I drill the holes for pinning, I also make sure to rough up the bottoms of the hooves to be pinned. It never hurts to have a little extra texture for the superglue to stick to. On this one gaunt, I accidentally cut off too much of the hoof. To fix it, I start with a piece of sanded plastic card and trimmed it to shape with my nippers and hobby knife. Then, using the thumb pushing technique, I carefully beveled the white horseshoe. The section I sliced off on accident was at an angle, so this had to be angled to compensate. Oh yeah, while I was drilling this, I noticed that you can see a split between the white and gray plastic in the curlicues coming out of the hole. Just thought I'd mention it. Well, I got them all pinned. Most of them have armature wire, but a few got paperclip. Without the plastic basing bits, their hooves will meet the base at an angle, so I need a thin steel pin if I don't want them to instantly snap off. The first step of these bases is to find a clay hill that matches the angle and position of the pinned hoof. Once I have it lined up on the base, I mark where to drill the hole and where to glue the hill. Then I glue it, with glue. Now, the base has an annoying peg hole, but that can just be plugged up with one of the severed pegs. I guess I could have also put the peg hole under the hill now that I think about it. The next step is to build a more interesting transition between the hill and the rest of the base. For this, I use hot glue. I haven't really tried this before, so let's see how it works. Before the glue cools, I press a rock into it. I'm not really after the texture of the rock itself, but rather the mattness of it. It's really hard to get adhesives to stick to smooth, frictionless hot glue. Eventually, I figured out that my finger works better. I mean, if you think about it, fingers are basically textured sculpting tools. Also, you can see my fingerprint. The final step is to brush on Mod Podge and apply tiny purple pebbles and sand. At this point, I've got most of the gaunts on their bases ready for flocking. But I've got a few here that don't have hills. I've got plans for these. I break out my itty bitty bug basing bits bag. These are made of, you guessed it, more polymer clay. I'll show you how to make these bits some other time, but for now I'm after the little ones. These are copied from a bit of Tyranid flora from the Leviathan box. I think there's only 1 or 2 per box, but 1 or 2 just won't cut it. As I previously mentioned, I don't like that the only basing bits for the small bugs are only next to the feet. After I cleaned them up, I glued them down. And now these bases are looking more like how I imagine a Tyranid environment would look. I did the same to 3 others, adding green hot glue for subtle variety of elevation. Well, they're all done, except for one. I actually misplaced one of the bases, and since these are 28mm bases, I don't have any extra. I have extra 25, 32, and 40, just not 28. But looking at the 28, it lines up rather nicely along the 25 and 32. This one belongs to a Termagaunt, by the way. I'm going to have to make a replacement. 'Cause it wouldn't be a Geared Hobbies project unless I had to jump through a myriad of hoops just to fix one tiny issue. This is totally my own fault, by the way. To make a replacement base, I smush silly putty into the bottom of an existing 28mm base. Once it's flat and flush, I peel it out and carefully press it onto a 32mm. Then, I spread Vaseline along the thin surface between the putty and the rim of the base. I mount the base and wrap the rim in Scotch tape. If you haven't gathered yet, I'm doing a resin pour. In the past, I've used this technique to extend base rims, minus the Vaseline. But since I use polymer clay these days, this is the first time I've done this in quite some time. I also made some dump molds out of silly putty to take the extra resin. Once the resin cured, I demolded my toxic goodies. The base came out pretty well. It was a little soft, so I did have to microwave it for a minute. I don't recommend doing that, but sometimes you gotta do what you gotta do. I cleaned up the base as best I could, then switched to detailing up one of the resin dump mold parts. I don't own a Land Raider, but I did get one of its track parts in a vehicle bits lot once. Joke's on you, Games Workshop. All I need is just one part for endless tracks. Anyway, since this part is made of soft resin, drilling holes was a breeze. I mark where I want to clip paperclip and clip it, followed by a steel file to flatten the end. An exposed axle at one end will help it look less like part of a toy and more like a fragment of a destroyed machine from the grimdark future. I place the track bit over the hole in the base. 2 birds with 1 stone. I cover the base in snot green hot glue and press it with my fingers. After drilling 1 more hole, I can finally pin the last termagant. I level the bottom of the base by sanding with a low grit nail file. The rim also gets a bit of sanding. In case you don't know, resin is toxic in almost all of its forms, including dust, which is why I wet sanded by wiping my nail files on a damp paper towel. And just like that, my last termagant is based. So, what are my thoughts on building plastic minis without the instructions? Well, I think there's some merit since hunting for each part on the sprue takes way too much time. But on the other hand, the instructions are definitely a valuable resource that you don't want to ignore. Going forward, I'm going to use them as an occasional reference. Also, if there are two-handed weapons, it's a good idea to pair them up as you cut them out. It's something I did over 2 years ago on my second ever squad of models, but something I forgot about until now, probably because I work on too many secondhand GW minis. In the next video, I'll show you how to make over-the-top bases for bigger models. Until then, have a good one.